miasma theory, that is the spreading of disease through contaminated or bad air or bad smells, and the humors theory. That's the idea that the body itself is made up of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black, and yellow or brown bile. Now, the Victorians believed that if any of those humors were out of whack, that typically meant that either the patient was already sick or would be sick in the next few days. Now, there were a number of different ways in which they could try and balance out an imbalancing of the humors, but one of the most common ways was by prescribing a wide variety of different medications that induced vomiting, induced chills, induced fever. In reality, however, many of these medications actually did very little when it came to actually curing a patient of really any of the ailments. But during this particular period, the Victorians believed that if you're having a reaction to our particular medication, then it must be working, right? Right? Oh, not really, but that's what the Victorians believed anyway. Well, during this particular period, as I mentioned, there was a real lack of understanding of really how disease was spread. Now, the dominant theory of the two theories was definitely the miasma theory, and actually Toronto itself was actually struck with several very, very devastating epidemics throughout the course of the 1800s. One of the most famous ones is actually the Toronto cholera epidemics of 1832 and 1834. Though one could theoretically argue that it was essentially just an extension of the 1832 epidemic, just continuing basically over the 3 years. And at the time, because they don't necessarily fully understand how disease is spread, the public health advice during that period was to close your windows, sleep with blankets over your head, and observe days of public fasting and humiliation. Again, all good ideas when you don't necessarily fully understand how a disease is spread. Now, I should mention, humiliation is the reflection of your previous bad actions. Perfect way to prevent disease, right? Now, in reality, though they believed at the time that cholera itself was spread through the bad miasmas or the bad air, in reality, cholera was actually spread through contaminated water. And Torontonians, as well as many other major cities, had been using their city streets as makeshift sewers for years and years and years and years and years, and consequently, the sewage was gradually seeping into their drinking water, and this is what was killing them. But unfortunately, it wouldn't necessarily be realized for another 30 years afterwards. Now, in addition, in 1847, we also had a very, very terrible typhoid epidemic. Now, typhoid is a very, very interesting disease, largely because it largely spreads asymptomatically. And by the time the patient actually starts to show any symptoms of typhoid fever, normally by that point it's typically too late. Now, during this particular period, in the 1840s, there was also the Irish potato famine. And because of that, starting in the 1840s, we begin to see large amounts of Irish immigrants beginning to arrive in Toronto, immigrating from Ireland to try and escape the Irish potato famine. And these individuals would have traveled on what they called coffin ships, which essentially were wooden ships with very, very, very basic accommodations, essentially a wooden bed, and basically space no larger than this, essentially. And they would be forced to travel in that, essentially in that space. They were allowed to go up on deck often, but in general, this essentially would be their living quarters for several weeks at a time. And so, because of this, this is also where, of course, they would do their business. This is where they would go to the bathroom, right in the same spot. So because of this, not only, of course, are they getting seasick, but they also have to deal with unbelievable levels of human waste, and, of course, sometimes spoiled food. Because of this, these ships that were taking these immigrants overseas were perfect breeding grounds for disease and sickness. And because of this, even though these passengers may not have necessarily been ill when they initially left port, by the time that they actually reached what was then known as the New World, only about 50% of the population of those ships actually made it to the New World. Many people would end up perishing on board those ships or shortly after riding those ships of the various different diseases that were on those ships. And principal among these was typhoid. Now, because of this increase in the typhoid epidemic, the Toronto City Council erected the first immigrant hospital, and it was located at the bottom of Reese Street at Reese's Wharf. And they also constructed what were called fever sheds or cholera sheds. And these essentially were isolation wards where they would place passengers who they deemed to be sick. And they would have agents that would walk around the port, and as each of the groups of immigrants would arrive here in the city, they would go through each of the individuals, and they would look for signs of different common diseases, including typhoid. And if they deemed you to be sick, you would then be sent to the isolation ward. The problem was, normally by the time, again, that you were showing symptoms, normally it was too late. By that point, you probably most likely spread it to at least 20 to 30 other people. So as you can imagine, it was really quite devastating. But eventually, with the establishment of a professional board of public health, we begin to see more strict health regulations begin to come into effect, as well as regular garbage collection. So it is really quite interesting when you get into that history as well. Are there any questions about the history of medicine during the period, or the history of this building at all, or anything else you've seen in the village at all?